to my interns for their shadow days on the following dates: Wes Basket on January 28th, Justine Went on February 4th, Shireen Kahl on February 11th, Inez Nieves on February 25th, Maria Abrozovit on March 4th, Finnegan Hecox on March 11th, Grace Davenport on March 18th, Kylie Huffman on March 25th, Xenia Ellis on April 15th, Anushka Pandey on April 22nd, Violet Sheehan on April 29th, Zach Marchetti on May 14th, Zach Shulik on May 20th, and Joseph Novak on June 3rd, as well as my fellows, Mary Treechuk and Robin Watson Mosier for the rest of the year.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. We are considering a trio of appropriation bills, and one of those is the appropriation bill or spending bill for Interior, Environment, and related agencies. I believe that this Interior bill for fiscal year 2026 is an important step toward Congress reclaiming its constitutional power of the purse. The bill protects funding for public lands, including national parks, wildlife refuges, conservation lands, and national forests. President Trump's proposed budget slashed $1 billion from the National Park Service and created the opportunity to transfer or sell off our national park treasures. This bill rejects that vision. It has a better plan: full staffing capacity for our national parks, full complement of seasonal staff, state and tribal historic preservation offices funded, and needed park maintenance and repairs funded. President Trump proposed massive cuts to the U.S. Forest Service, which would be devastating, $1.4 billion in cuts. Those of us who live in the West, who have significant amounts of federal forests, know how much investment it takes to appropriately manage these lands. So this bill presents a better plan. It funds the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program. It preserves state forestry grants and programs for research and forest health management. It invests in hazardous fuels reduction projects and wildfire preparedness and suppression efforts. It ensures that federal wildlife firefighters are fully paid. The bill funds the Land and Water Conservation Fund at $900 million instead of a much smaller amount proposed by the president. And this bill requires that all projects get funded, not simply projects that the president favors. The bill fully funds payment in lieu of taxes, normally known as PILT, to ensure counties across the country, especially rural communities, have resources they need. The bill upholds our commitment and treaty obligations to tribes. It rejects President Trump's attempt to slash $1 billion from tribal programs. It boosts funding for the Indian Health Service. It provides resources to staff newly opened hospitals and clinics. And it preserves the Indian Health Service's advance appropriation for fiscal year 2027 to ensure that if there is a government shutdown, health care through the Indian Health Service will not shut down. That's protection for 2.5 million people across Indian country. President Trump proposed gutting the Environmental Protection Agency. This bill has a better plan. It provides almost $5 billion above his budget. It protects the Energy Star program, the water and wastewater state revolving funds, so important to so many communities across the land, and the WIFIA program, the Water Infrastructure Finance Innovation Act, that provides low-cost loans for large water projects across the country that would otherwise be unaffordable. It preserves programs for air quality management and pollution control. And the bill includes more than $1.7 billion for community-initiated projects. Now, these are projects where communities said, here's our top priority, and senators then advocated, and House members advocated, that those projects be included in this budget. That is a powerful vision of a local understanding of the best and the most important need being addressed through this bill. Often that involves replacing wastewater treatment plants or restoring critical watersheds. This bill, in addition to these programs, takes another critical step forward. When programs are included in an appropriation bill, the details of how Congress intends for those funds to be spent are traditionally laid out in report language. Now, the report language doesn't have the force of law, but in the understanding of the separation of powers, the administrations of the past respected and operated according to that report language. Every single former presidential administration has honored those directives, but not the Trump administration. And that's why we have included 140 new line items in legislative text, moving items that used to be in report language into the actual language of the law. You know, it's a challenge. It's a challenge if the administration does not respect the visions laid out through the language of our spending bills. How can members of Congress negotiate a compromise that includes priorities of different senators from different parts of the country, different House members from all over the country, if a president's going to say, well, you know what? I've decided I'm simply not going to act on some of those projects. Maybe I'll only implement the projects for red states and not blue states. Or maybe a different president might say, I'll do the projects for blue states, but not red states. Or senators I like rather than senators I don't like. No, that is unacceptable. Every time you hear the phrase of the administration saying, a cabinet member or the president himself, we're going to cut programs that don't align with the administration's priorities, that is an authoritarian, strongman state comment that breaks the law and guts the Constitution. That is the administration stealing the power of the purse. The founders deliberately placed the power of the purse, the spending power, with Congress. You can read it in Article 1 of the Constitution. Because it is therefore the people's representatives who decide the design of the programs and how much money they will receive. If just the chief executive makes those decisions, then we don't have a president, we have a king, we have a tyrant, and we here in Congress have failed our responsibility to defend the Constitution. Yes, that Constitution, the one we took an oath to defend. It is the vision of a democratic republic that we come together from all over the country, from different walks of life, and work together to forge spending bills and authorizing bills that serve interests across this nation. In a continuing resolution last year, Congress abdicated that responsibility. We failed in defending the Constitution and effectively handed the president a blank check. And that's exactly what Trump wanted this year. Another blank check to operate as a tyrant instead of a constitutional president. But he's not getting it. We have protections in these spending bills that take a significant stride towards defense of our constitutional responsibility and the power of the purse. Now, it is not as strong a language as I would have liked. And yes, there is vulnerability to slow walking or freezing or transferring, but we've taken a strong step in the right direction. There's more we need to do in that, more than we ever thought we had to do, but it's going to take the majority and minority parties working together to fully restore our responsibility under the Constitution. A huge thank you to the chair of the committee, the subcommittee, Senator Murkowski. She is a great partner to work with. We come from different sides of the aisle, but we both come from states full of BLM lands, Bureau of Land Management lands, that is, full of forests, full of challenges that are addressed in this bill. We both care a great deal about the environment that we have the responsibility to defend now and hand to the next generation in healthy condition. The bill that we worked on together here in the Senate, it passed the Senate committee 26-2. That says a lot. To summarize, the bill before us today rejects the president's disastrous cuts. It defends our public lands and our tribal programs and our environment. It keeps out new poison pill writers, and there were a lot of them in the House version of this bill. Together, let's proceed to do more of this kind of bipartisan work and to enable the responsibilities invested in Congress to be fulfilled in responsibility to our constituents across the nation and the structure of our democratic republic. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator from Michigan is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise today as the new senator from the state of Michigan, and in particular to recognize the 10-year anniversary of the declaration of emergency for the city of Flint, Michigan, 10 years on. In April of 2014, the city of Flint decided to switch the city's water source from Lake Huron to the Flint River. It was a decision made by state officials to save money at the time, but neither the city nor the state made sure to treat the new water before it came into Flint's taps. And because of that, an American city was poisoned. In less than 2 years, 100,000 people were exposed to toxic levels of lead, bacteria, heavy metals like iron, and chemicals known to cause cancer. That includes about 10,000 children. Imagine the big house at U of M packed on a game day, and that's how many people were poisoned. 10 years ago this week, President Barack Obama declared a federal state of emergency in the city of Flint. And that declaration wasn't necessarily the beginning of the crisis, but it was supposed to be the beginning of the end, a turning point where Flint could begin to recover. But let me be clear, the crisis in Flint has not ended. Not in Flint, not in Michigan, and as a Michigander and Flint's senator, not for me. Flint is a community still in pain, still seeking justice, still seeking accountability. And as Flint's newest senator, I wanted to be here on the 10-year anniversary to make sure Michiganders and Americans don't forget what happened. So like I said, let's review the bidding. Flint is an apocalyptic poisoning of an American city. And it should be a warning to all Americans of what happens when there's not accountability. It's a story of government's failure to protect its citizens. And more than that, it's a story of human tragedy, of ordinary people living ordinary lives, people like Brittany Thomas. Brittany lives in Flint. She has 2 children, Jabari and Janaea. Janaea was just a year old when the city of Flint switched their water from the Flint River. Jabari was 4. Around her, Brittany's neighbors began seeing foam coming out of their taps. Their water was yellow or brown or rust-colored. It smelled metallic. Visible particles were floating around in the water. Soon, Brittany and her children started developing unexplained rashes. Jania's soft baby skin was streaked with red, riddled with bumps. Concerned, Brittany, of course, reached out to her pediatrician. Then her children started having seizures. For months, they were in and out of the hospital. Brittany didn't know why. She could only watch in panic as her kids grew sicker. To the parents watching this, imagine your 1-year-old baby, this tiny, helpless life that you're supposed to protect, seizing again and again, and you have no idea what's going on. There are no words to describe that terror. Being in and out of the hospital had other consequences. Brittany lost multiple jobs. She began struggling with her bills. She was forced to borrow money from loved ones, and the effects of these unexplainable illnesses seeped into every aspect of their lives. For the rest of 2014, more and more families in Flint began to experience sudden, strange symptoms: thinning hair, rashes, seizures, pain, and chronic conditions. Kids began developing speech impediments, seemingly out of nowhere. Students consistently getting A's and B's were suddenly having a hard time being able to read or think clearly. Their grades slipped. Some developed learning disabilities. Many kids started showing changes in their behavior, where once they were calm, sweet, and curious, they became extremely anxious, emotional, and aggressive. Their parents have no idea why. There was no visible reasons, no obvious explanation. Water, even when it's poisoned, leaves very few visible scars. It wasn't until doctors ran blood tests that Brittany discovered her children had lead poisoning. Families across the city started to get the same diagnosis. But that wasn't enough of an explanation. Brittany knew it. So did other parents. And they suspected there was a link between their kids getting sick and the brown water coming out of their taps. So they began demanding answers. They raised issues with the city council, with county leadership, with state officials. Every time they got the same response: our tests are showing that the water is just fine. Others waved off the signs. Flint is a poor city. Its residents are mostly African American. It was way too easy for leaders to just shrug and look away. Sometimes people actually laughed. Some parents were spending days at a time in the hospital. They were living a nightmare, and they were asking their leaders for help. And instead of getting answers and support, they were dismissed. Brittany and other parents, including Melissa Mays and Leanne Waters, wondered if the city's tests were actually accurate. They decided to test the water for themselves. So in January of 2015, they got boxes of test kits and instructions from a lab supervisor from Flint's water treatment plant. They paid for it with Melissa's tax refund. The accepted limit on lead for drinking water is 15 parts per billion. One home, the home of Leanne Walters, showed a test reading 104 parts per billion. Leanne tested her water again a few weeks later. This time it jumped to 400 parts per billion. And the water her kids were drinking, bathing in, brushing their teeth in, contained more than 25 times the amount of lead that is safe for children. Terrified and frustrated, she called the EPA to complain. She reached a researcher named Miguel Del Toro, who began investigating. Over the next few weeks, Miguel asked Michigan's Department of Environmental Quality over and over again whether Flint's water had been treated properly. First, they said it had been treated. Then they admitted it hadn't. Miguel couldn't believe what he was hearing. Flint was an older city, which meant their plumbing was mostly lead pipes. In his field, it was common knowledge that corrosion control was needed to prevent exactly this type of crisis. Brittany, Melissa, and other parents organized marches and protests almost every week. In July, over 500 people marched 70 miles from Detroit to Flint. Everyone from local media to international press to Hollywood directors started paying more attention. And yet, when Michigan outlets reached out to the state's environmental department, their spokesman said the following: anyone who is concerned about lead in the drinking water in Flint can relax. Doctors like Dr. Mona Hanna, a pediatrician, compared the results to her own patients' records from the last 2 years. The results matched exactly. Flint was being poisoned by its own drinking water. Dr. Mona and other doctors teamed up with parents to shine a light on these results, and they talked to anyone who would listen. It's an important lesson in banging pots and pans until you get the help you need. But it took almost 2 full years of advocacy and fight from Flint's parents for their kids to get this declaration of an emergency. During those 2 years and beyond, the scale of the government's deception started coming out. Detroit press reported that the city had known about the risk to the water before they even switched the source. A city report back in 2011 had identified the Flint River as corrosive, in need of special chemicals. Both city and state officials reported that as early as 2013, a year before the city water switched. But Michigan's own state environmental department had been doing exactly what they accused others of doing, manipulating data. They had changed city reports to make the lead levels look within acceptable levels. The state's tests, which they had cited for months to discredit the Flint parents, were revealed to have been cherry-picked. Meanwhile, federal reports of lead in Flint's water had been buried by senior officials at the Environmental Protection Agency until Miguel, that one researcher we spoke about, risked his job and leaked the reports to press. Starting things off, 12 people died from Legionnaire's disease alone. In fact, Flint knew how to fix these problems before they even changed the water and did it anyways. Treating Flint's water would have cost approximately $60 a day. For $60 a day, officials could have prevented 100,000 people from getting poisoned. Now, what has that led to? Flint's advocacy changed more than just the city's water source. It changed Michigan. Michigan is the Great Lakes state. Water is part of our core identity. And we've always seen ourselves as protectors of our nation's water. Threats to our water are threats to our very identity as Michiganders. To be frightened of our water hits at the core of who we are. But Flint helped us realize that protecting water doesn't just start and stop at the Great Lakes. It includes the water around us, in our rivers, and in our taps. Because of Flint, Michigan is now a powerful voice speaking out on the issues like PFAS and chemical contamination, river pollution. Republican or Democrat, Michiganders see themselves as stewards of all of America's water, no matter where it flows. And it's no exaggeration to say that Flint changed our country. More than 10 years after the crisis in Flint, billions of dollars have been spent going to American cities to swap out lead pipes, including hundreds of millions for Michigan, secured by Senators Debbie Stabenow and Gary Peters. The issue of aging lead pipes drew national attention. Cities in New Jersey, Colorado, Kentucky began replacing their aging pipes. In 2018, Michigan became the first state to require the removal of all lead pipes. And citizens were empowered to hold elected officials accountable for environmental negligence rather than just companies. But all of that is, frankly, cold comfort to the people of Flint. In their community, the damage has been done. More than a decade later, it's still ongoing. An entire generation of Flint's children still live with the long-term effects of lead poisoning. It never leaves the body. Learning disabilities, ADHD, anxiety and depression, not to mention PTSD. Studies estimate that roughly 3,000 children have been diagnosed with these conditions and more. The actual number could be much higher. Flint schools paid a heavy price. Test scores dropped dramatically. Special needs requests spiked. Enrollment in Flint schools plummeted from 8,500 students in 2012 to less than 3,000 this year. More than 20 school buildings are sitting empty. Both Brittany's kids still suffer from recurring seizures almost 12 years after the crisis began. Her son, Jabari, has extreme anxiety and issues with his memory. He began struggling in school. Around her, Brittany's friends and loved ones now have chronic, incurable conditions. Children whose kidneys are so damaged that they are in constant risk of severe dehydration, women with repeated and above normal miscarriage rates. Teenagers with hardened heavy metals deposits in their heels and in their knees, making it painful to sit or stand. Parents with a slew of autoimmune disorders, lupus, rheumatoid arthritis. With every hospital stay, every specialist visit, every missed day of school, Brittany and her loved ones are forced to relive that trauma, helplessness, panic, and confusion, not to mention pain in their everyday lives. The story is not over yet, even 10 years on. They're still fighting to be heard. Flint wants accountability. Who wouldn't? They deserve nothing less. After an American city is poisoned, people died. Children lost their parents. People lost their siblings, neighbors, friends. So nearly 10 years later, Flint residents have brought charges, criminal and civil, against everyone involved in treating this catastrophe. They sued the city. They sued the county. They sued the engineers who switched, the engineering firms, who switched Flint's water. They sued the state of Michigan, including Governor Rick Snyder at the time, for their staggering lack of oversight. And they've sued the EPA, which was supposed to be the backstop for everything, who consistently buried reports of lead poisoning instead of holding officials accountable. Most of these cases have been settled, with one notable exception, the EPA. More than a decade later, the EPA is denying, deflecting, and dragging out this cause in court. And in fact, the Trump administration, just like the Biden administration, has the ability to settle this case without Congress or anyone else. They should either take their day in court or settle fairly. But it was never really about money for Flint. People wanted someone to take responsibility. And unfortunately, Flint residents are yet to see anything from a settlement over the last decade. Timeliness for the rest of their payouts are vague and always changing, and estimated amounts of initial payments are unacceptably small. It's possible that Flint families will not see the dollars that they are owed. No apology, no amount of assigning blame, and certainly no amount of money can make Flint whole. But even after all they've endured over the past decade, this community is being denied what little they were promised. And that should make every American furious. Now, as Flint's newest federal senator, I see my responsibility to fight for Flint. It's not their job to push, prod, or hope a decade later. Flint deserves someone who actually is up for that fight. I am determined to follow in the footsteps of the leaders who have come before me, former Congressman Dan Kildee, former Senator Debbie Stabenow, Gary Peters, Jim Ananich, Mayor Sheldon Neely, who's now still in office. These are people who have fought for Flint, in Michigan, and in this very building. I will take that torch proudly and strive to be worthy of the appreciation of Flint residents. I know there will be more fights and setbacks for Flint. There will be consistent fights for dollars, to get over promises broken, for accountability and apologies. But I want to say here on the floor of the Senate directly to Flint, no matter what is coming, I have your back, and it is my responsibility to fight for you. Thank you, Mr. President, and I yield back.